Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, there's been a lot of talk in the news lately about the idea in the United States of birthright citizenship. In other words, the idea that if you are born in the borders of the United States, anywhere, whether your parents are citizens or not, just by virtue of being born in our territory, you are, from birth, an American citizen. And that goes back to the events surrounding the American Civil War and the aftermath and what to do with millions of what we called freedmen, the men, women, and children who had left enslavement and now had to be integrated into society as citizens. The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments were meant to deal with that, and the 14th Amendment eventually was used to define the idea of birthright citizenship. And of course, now the debate is about people coming across the border and giving birth to their children so that their children would automatically become citizens, and whether or not that should be the case. So with all of that in mind, I saw that Vox, with their 12.5 million subscribers, recently did a video about this called Why the U.S. Has Birthright Citizenship. So I thought this would be a great topic for us to talk about, given the historic connection to current events. I'll put the link in the description so you can check it out without my commentary. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
In the years after the American Civil War, the U.S. made 3 amendments to its national constitution that, among other things, established rights for African Americans. One of those amendments abolished slavery. One granted the right to vote to African American men, and one, among other things, gave African Americans the right of citizenship.
So, as is the case with a lot of our constitutional amendments, but also the Constitution itself, there's constantly a philosophical debate in the United States about how the Constitution should be interpreted. There are those, typically conservatives, who tend to say that they are originalists. In other words, what was the original intention? So when the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution, what did they intend for those things to mean? When the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, what was the intention of those things? Where you have on the other end of things, the other extreme, you have people who believe in this idea that the Constitution is a living, breathing document that can be interpreted based on the times. In other words, just because it meant one thing in 1865 does not mean that it needs to mean the same thing in 2025. In other words, we can reinterpret it based on the current events. And it's that debate that is centered around the 14th Amendment.
But this one, the 14th Amendment, dealing with citizenship, it was interesting. It never actually used the words African or black or race or former slaves. Instead, it contained a rule that, with some exceptions, being born in the U.S. would make you a citizen of the U.S. Birthright citizenship. If you're born here, you're a citizen here.
Now, obviously, if you look at this, you think, okay, given the context in which it was passed, it was definitely there to deal with the problem of going back to the Dred Scott case back in the 1850s, where you had this man who was ruled by the Supreme Court to not be a citizen of the United States and therefore not have standing in court. Well, they had to deal with that because you can't free millions of people and then say, but you can't be citizens. But was that intended to apply to other people in the future? And that's the debate.
Birthright citizenship.
Ending birthright citizenship.
In 2025, on Donald Trump's first day as again president, he signed an executive order to end birthright citizenship for the children of anyone temporarily or unlawfully in the U.S. Over the next few weeks, that order was blocked by more than one federal judge, with one of the cases calling birthright citizenship a foundation of our democracy. And as of this video, we don't actually know how this will all shake out, if the Trump administration will back down, if the Supreme Court will back them up. But
so, yeah, and I think that's really what this is about, is I don't think Donald Trump unilaterally has the authority to just declare an end to birthright citizenship, because obviously that's something that comes down to the constitutional definition based on the 14th Amendment. But what that did was trigger an opportunity for the courts to revisit that. And it may be that the Supreme Court will rule that the 14th Amendment does or does not apply to the situation that they're describing here.
Trump had his eye on birthright citizenship for some time.
Number one, the 14th Amendment is very questionable as to whether or not somebody can come over, have a baby, and immediately that baby is a citizen.
And he hasn't been the only one to feel that way. Today, 40% of Americans think that the children of undocumented immigrants should not be given birthright citizenship. The meaning of the 14th Amendment didn't just come up for debate this year. It's actually an argument we've been having with ourselves as a country going way back. And a lot of that debate has been around this idea of who is supposed to get citizenship and who isn't. Like, for example,
the 14th Amendment meant to give citizenship to freed slaves. It was never meant to give citizenship to foreign aliens.
So, okay. Is that true? What does the law actually say about birthright citizenship? And why have Americans been arguing over it for almost 200 years? So in this video, we're going to look at the 3 moments that made us a country where everyone born here is a citizen. We're going to start with
Dred Scott.
Actually, with none of these. First, we're going to start quickly here at the original U.S. Constitution, which said nothing about who is and is not a citizen. The idea that you're a citizen if you're born here, that existed, but it was more of a legal assumption at the time, inherited from English common law.
Right.
Just simply
Hey, actually, it was interesting because I was just having this discussion with Christoph, who is one of the people who was on our tour with us in Egypt. He's born in Germany, lives part-time in Australia, and he's a lawyer, and he was talking about this idea of the different bases for law in Germany versus the United States and England and places like that, where we have common law, but in Germany they don't. They just have statute law, a very different basis for how we do things.
Stood if you were born in the realm, you were subject of the king.
Which itself came from this old Roman idea of jus soli, or the right of soil, as opposed to the right of blood, where citizenship is passed down from your parents. But because jus soli is more of a principle than a law, for the first 70-ish years of the U.S., there aren't really specific rules on who is and isn't born an American citizen. Until 1857, just a few years before the Civil War, a time when the U.S. looks like this. Some states where slavery is legal, some where it isn't. And around this time, an enslaved man is taken by his enslaver from a slave state into free territory, and he eventually files a lawsuit saying that entering free territory should have made him a free man. His case eventually goes to the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., and it will come to be known as the Dred Scott decision. That's his name. And what the court says is neither Scott nor his family are free. And they add that he's also not a citizen. And in fact, they say that as a rule, a person of the African race cannot be a U.S. citizen by birth.
Absolutely ridiculous decision. And this is why, just for me personally, whenever I hear the idea of the courts saying, you know what, because something is settled law, it's been decided long ago, we shouldn't revisit it. These are the kinds of cases I think of where the Supreme Court got it horribly wrong. Or things like Plessy versus Ferguson. If Plessy versus Ferguson in the 1890s, if we had decided in the 1950s that that was settled law, that separate but equal was okay, then we would still have segregation today. But thankfully, the Supreme Court went back and revisited that and said, you know what? That court was wrong. And sometimes that's the case, and that's okay.
Or otherwise.
The Supreme Court ultimately concludes that they weren't considered to be the part of the people of the United States, part of the citizenry of the United States.
At this time, there are many free black people in the free states of the U.S. But this court decision officially says that the country now has 2 classes of people. Those who are citizens or who can become citizens or whose children can be citizens, and those for whom none of that applies. And within a few years, ideas like that have literally torn the U.S. apart. These states secede. And these states go to war against them, partly to eliminate slavery and that 2-tiered system.
Eventually, that's
and
what
they
they
win.
were fighting for. But not at
So
first.
now the Civil War is over, and the victorious North decides to undo the Dred Scott case by passing the first American law to say that people born here are citizens, the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Problem number one. The president at the time has some objections to this, and in a letter to Congress, he complains that in addition to African Americans, birthright citizenship is also going to make gypsies and Chinese people citizens.
Oh, can't have that. And this is, it's fascinating because this is kind of what happens in the aftermath of the Civil War, is that when you have these laws passed that give these protections to the freedmen, then the focus shifts, especially out in West, where you start to have a lot of Chinese immigration. And now the government's saying, you know what, all right, maybe we can allow these newly freed, former enslaved people who were born here to be citizens. But these people coming from China, this is a different story altogether. And you get things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, and you get these kinds of decisions and discussions going on.
But Congress actually has enough votes to pass it over the president's objections, and it becomes law. But problem number two.
There would always be the risk that the civil rights laws could be modified by a subsequent Congress.
A future Congress could theoretically repeal the law. So to make birthright citizenship a more permanent part of the law, they also decide to write it into a constitutional amendment, what will become the 14th Amendment. And it says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. This is the language that will put birthright citizenship into the U.S. Constitution. But it will also eventually be the source of some debate because of this line,
Right.
the qualifier, subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. For example, let's say an immigrant comes to the U.S. and then has a child. Are they subject to the U.S.'s jurisdiction? The amendment itself doesn't elaborate on this. But before Congress passes the 14th Amendment, as they debate it, they actually keep pretty good records of their conversations. For example, one senator asks the rest of the Senate, won't this give citizenship to the children of Chinese people? Another senator says, yes, the child of an Asian is as much a citizen as the child of a European.
The debate.
And this goes back to that debate about original intent. And does that even matter? Some people would say, well, this matters. Other people would say it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is how we apply it today. That's the debate.
Debates over the 14th Amendment matter because they showed that they understood that children of immigrants would become citizens at birth under this rule.
So it's with that understanding that birthright citizenship enters the Constitution. A big majority of Congress votes for it, but not everyone. For example, this guy, the one that was concerned about Chinese people becoming citizens, he does not vote for it. And that is actually important. The 14th Amendment becoming law doesn't necessarily mean that everyone likes it.
Right.
Remember that. It's going to come back later. And after a quick break, we're going to talk about where that debate goes next and how it creates the 14th Amendment's first big test. Okay, so far in the story, we've seen both a president and a senator voice kind of the same concern about specifically Chinese people becoming American citizens. And this is actually pretty emblematic of this time period when there are a growing number of Chinese laborers in the U.S., along with a growing sentiment from some that they don't belong here. And in 1882, Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it says, among other things, Chinese immigrants can't become citizens. Though it doesn't say anything about their children. And this is only meant to last 10 years, but it ends up being the first of several Chinese Exclusion Acts that remain in effect until 1943. And it's in that context that a few years after the Chinese Exclusion Act, a guy from San Francisco goes to visit his family in China. A few months later, he comes back and is denied entry to the U.S. He says, but I was born here. I'm a citizen. And his case eventually goes to the Supreme Court.
And this is where you're going to start to get kind of a documented previous case law. And so now if and when the Supreme Court in our modern time takes this back up, they're going to look at these previous cases. They're going to look at the original intent. They're going to listen to those arguments, and they're going to decide how this applies.
The guy's name is Wong Kim Ark. He's around 25, works as a cook, has a wife and child back in China, and his case is kind of the perfect test for the 14th Amendment, which, remember, says you're a citizen if you're born here and if you're subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. So here's the question. When Wong was born here to his Chinese immigrant parents who were not U.S. citizens, was he under the jurisdiction of and thus a citizen of the place he was born? Or was he a citizen of the place his parents were from? In 1898, the court makes their decision. Wong Kim Ark is a citizen. The court says there's 3 types of people in the U.S. who are not subject to the country's jurisdiction: diplomats, certain Native Americans, and invading forces occupying territory.
Okay.
Their children are not citizens at birth. But
This is actually really important because they are taking that clause in the 14th Amendment that says, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and they're defining what that means. Now, will a subsequent court redefine that?
other than that, partly because of what is written down in those congressional debate records, the court rules that subject to the jurisdiction was intended to mean pretty much everyone here, including immigrants and their children.
With rare
exceptions. Everyone in the U.S. is subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S., and thus everyone born here is a citizen. And that basically remains the legal consensus to this day.
For more than a century, officials have acted in concert. It is the repeated recognition by everyone within the legal system that this is the correct meaning of the 14th Amendment.
But a legal consensus, it's not necessarily the same as a popular consensus.
Right.
In the 1980s and 1990s, the population of undocumented immigrants starts to go up, and birthright citizenship comes back as a political issue.
A growing chorus of Republican lawmakers are demanding another look at the 14th Amendment.
Subject to the jurisdiction, illegals don't fall under that, just like diplomats' children.
If the 14th Amendment had not existed, my great-grandparents would not have been citizens.
Disagreement over birthright citizenship is not new. In fact, I'm going to tell you one more story about the 14th Amendment. Way back when Congress originally voted for it, part of why an amendment giving citizenship to African Americans was able to pass with these kinds of margins is because at the end of the Civil War, only these states were even represented in Congress. But for the 14th Amendment to become official, to become part of the Constitution, it also had to be ratified, voted for by 3/4 of all the state governments. And that did not happen at first. None of these states wanted to ratify it.
Yeah, but then we made it we made ratifying the Reconstruction Amendments a qualification, a qualifier for being readmitted to the Union. Because remember, during Reconstruction, when it starts, these states have, by their own decision, removed themselves from the Union. And so there are certain qualifications that are made in order to be able to be readmitted, and one by one that happens.
And then Congress made them. They said these states will only be readmitted to Congress if they ratify this amendment. You have lost a war, and these are the terms of peace. And one way to look at that is that this amendment is kind of different. It isn't just some law from a long time ago. It's a treaty. It represented the leaving behind of an old country and the formation of a new one.
That's fair. Fair way to look at it.
Today, just like back then, the president is someone who doesn't agree that birthright citizenship should apply to everyone, even though, to be clear, a majority of Americans think it should. And once again, it seems like the final call will be up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which for more than 100 years has recognized again and again that birthright citizenship is the law. We'll see what happens this time.
Yep. That was interesting. That was well done. I thought that was a great presentation that gives kind of the background to all of this. And these are the kinds of things it's important for us to talk about, because it's good to understand in the context of current events what is being debated, what the past has said about all this. And it doesn't mean that that's what's going to happen this time. It could be that we see an undoing of what has happened for the last 160 years where it's concerning birthright citizenship. Who knows? But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Keep it civil. It's okay to disagree strongly, but do so in a way that recognizes the respect that we need to give to each other, even on topics in which we passionately disagree. Thanks for watching.